All right. Hey, welcome everybody. Good afternoon. This is Connect with Adult Ed, the NMEA podcast. I am Jamie Trujillo and traditionally the co-host. I usually don't even do these intros. It's usually our host, Nadia Cater. We're switching it up a little bit, although Nadia is still here today. Hey, Nadia.
Yeah, I mean, I take a day off and I guess just Jamie just takes over. I
Totally took over. I got used to it. I got the bug from the last episode, and now I just want to just go for it, I guess. But
Yes.
yeah, we are here today with Tim Amaral, who actually was at our annual conference a couple of months ago. By the time you listen to this, it'll have been a couple of months at that point to do a few trainings. And so I don't want to give away too much. Tim is going to be talking about what he does and a little bit about that training as well, so that we can all get a good idea of what he brings to the table as far as adult education, professional development goes. So, hi, Tim. Good afternoon. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Hello, Jamie. Hello, Nadia. Thank you both for having me on. For those of us who do the work in adult ed, we know that moments like this are actually few and far between. So they're very precious to me as a veteran adult educator. I know that if you'd said, "Hey, Tim, you want to be on a podcast?" 10 years ago, it would have been an absolute miracle for it to be happening around adult ed. And so now we're a little bit farther down the road in terms of developing these types of things, but it's still, the gratitude is still not lost on me. I'm still extremely grateful for the opportunity, both to be here with you in this and then also have presented with you in New Mexico.
Very well said. And thank you again so much. Why don't you just start by telling us a little bit about you and your background in adult
Okay.
ed?
So, like a lot of educators in the field, I sort of fell backwards into adult ed and then discovered how wonderful it was and decided not to leave. I had been working in special ed in Monterey County as a substitute teacher back in 92. And my boss on one of my long-term sub assignments said, "Hey, do you want to be permanent?" I said, "Well, I'd love to be permanent." She said, "Go check out the adult school." And I said, like many adult educators, "What's an adult school?" And she said, the old night school formula where people get their GED, et cetera, et cetera. It's a bigger thing now because I had trained to be K-12 and work in special ed while I was coming up. I said, "Oh, all right, I'll go give it a try." And I never left. It just was a really good match for my own life experience, my educational background, and my goals as an educator. I really felt like I got very lucky landing in adult ed. Now, anybody who works in adult ed in California knows you have to have a whole lot of side gigs to be able to pay your mortgage while you're working in adult ed. So I always had things going on the side. I ran a martial arts studio for 30 years. I also worked for a nonprofit agency called the Breakthrough Men's Community that's dedicated to healing, recovery, and support. And it's that sort of amalgamation of those three arenas that set the stage for launching this work that I do now. It was just a very odd coalescing of opportunity and preparation and a whole lot of encouragement from other folks out there in the world to say, Tim, maybe you should think about sharing this material with other people. And I said, "Oh, well, you think so? Okay, I'll give it a try." And the next thing you know, my company was born.
That is really awesome, and it seems like at this point, it's almost like just a full circle moment. You've gone from that part-time and probably even at some points full-time teaching to having the, culmination of all of that experience, those years of experience, turn into a resource that you are now sharing with other practitioners, which is really amazing. And that is, I believe, the company that you kind of alluded to, which is called ASEST.
Yes.
So, what services does this company provide?
So primarily, I provide professional development for educators in the field of adult education and continuing ed, alternative ed, those arenas, also college campuses, et cetera. Anybody who's working with usually late teen years into adulthood. That's who is reaching out to me these days and saying, would you please come train my staff? And it was very fortunate. There's almost something cosmic at play in the way this story came about. My background in the martial arts gave me the ability to read a body and do threat assessment in terms of what the other person is experiencing as well as what I'm experiencing. It was a skill that was cultivated over decades. So in the classroom, it allowed me to read my students' physiological reactions to the work that I would be giving them, to the place where they were sitting, to whatever person walked in through the door. And then that cue gave me the direction that I needed to go. And my work with the breakthrough community, and in particular, the therapeutic model that we learned there, as well as the internal family systems therapeutic model developed by Dr. Dick Schwartz. That gave me a set of skills where I could respond to the distress that I was seeing my students go through. And because I could respond to that level of social need, my students would relax and they'd feel comfortable and they would not feel that the classroom was not being responsive to them. And my students, they were really the ones in the beginning who kept saying, Tim, you've got to go share this with people. You've got to go train other teachers, because if my teachers knew what you do in the classroom at an earlier age, I never would have ended up in your room in the first place. And then the second part of that story is that Dr. Dick Schwartz found out about what I was doing and connected me with a group back east in the IFS community, the internal family systems community, to design models that could be used in a lot of different arenas. And so I got in with a group called the Self-Leadership Collaborative. There was a research project run, and the next thing you know, I'm training people, and it just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. It's growing not due to ambition on my part, but due to need out there in the world. And so there's a wonderful inertia that's going with it, where I can just sort of hang on for the ride and see where things go. And because I'm presenting work and providing skills that allow people to face really common challenges, I would say even pervasive challenges that come up in the field of education and specifically in adult education, it's been very gratifying to be in the center of that as it moves forward, because I can see my students' faces and I know their stories and I know what good they were able to see within themselves and then grow and then give out to the rest of the world. And so I have a great deal of confidence that this model is effective and it produces the kind of fruit that we dream about as educators, where we watch people flip their life story and not just flip it in that sort of nuts and bolts practical sense where I've gone from, working 14 hours a day to working 8 hours a day so I can be home with my kids now. Not just from that really practical standpoint of being a person who's integrated into the sort of capitalistic model that we have here. For me, the big bang for the buck is in that space where their relationships have started to change because their sense of self-worth has started to change. So their kids at home see mom and dad acting with this much more self-led energy where their self-worth is central to their experience. And then I know the kids won't face half of what the parents faced in terms of challenges through life, because their parents are going to be in a much healthier space.
There were a lot of things that you just talked about that really struck me. One being this want to help the individual student grow, not just in that practical sense that you were talking about. Growing as an individual person and being able to generationally change that, the generational trauma that we see, the
Yeah.
generational poverty and hardship that we see, and looking at the role of the adult educator as somebody who does that. And coming from a psychology background myself, that is something that I always carried with me into the classroom when I was still teaching,
Yeah.
was this idea that teaching to the test, which I don't even believe we do anymore, just as a field as a whole. I don't believe that we do that. We are really looking at that big picture. And I just love that. I love that what you are teaching, what you are bringing to the table for your professional development offerings is a way to do that, a way to look at that bigger picture and that entire individual and how that person can grow and change. And the other thing that really stuck out to me is that you had said that this was something your students were telling you needed to give to, the community in the field,
Yeah.
which I just love. I love that they were so excited and so moved and so changed by it that they felt that it needed to be shared, that other people needed to know about that. So that is super, super cool.
I can see their faces as you're telling this to me, as you're sharing this with me. And I think back. So, one of the things that I did for a couple of years in class was I did the Adverse Childhood Experiences Survey, the ASEST survey, where you talk about the 10 different types of trauma that a person can experience and how that affects your life outcomes in terms of health, education, productivity, family success, all that kind of stuff. And what I found out was that the trauma in adult ed is hyper concentrated. It is incredibly high relative to the classroom population. So we run rates that are comparable to people who are in the penitentiary system. And in fact, in some areas, we're probably higher in certain things than the folks on the inside are. And so when we think about that population walking through the door and then their normal historical experience with education and how they were quite often defined as the problem, they're the wrong thing in the room, to watch what shifts inside of them when they realize that that story holds no currency anymore, when they realize that they have both the right and the responsibility to change the narrative. And there are tools and pathways that are available to them that they can see in a lived experience happening right in front of them. There is almost a type of overwhelm that happens, but it's like a joy pain moment where you're simultaneously like really happy and really angry about the bad stuff that you got in the past. And so that energy that they had in my class when this was all taking shape, there was almost, when I say joy pain and there's a little bit of anger hidden underneath the joy, I'm not kidding. They were almost like angry with me, like, Tim, you have to go tell them about us. You have to go do this. And so I really want to honor that energy. And then the last thing I want to say about that is the outcomes have staying power. Right. So when I first started my career and I hadn't yet integrated this material in a structured way inside my class, and I didn't have the vocabulary for it. There may have been some sort of innate skills that were happening in there, but it was not. My old martial arts instructor used to say, if you can say a thing, you know a thing. And if you can't say a thing, you don't know a thing. So at that stage of my career, I couldn't articulate it. But once I started to get the ability to articulate it and we started to normalize it in the classroom in a conversational way where it's not some extra thing that has to be done, it's just how we talk to each other every day. That once that shift occurred, I stopped reading about my students in the headlines 2 or 3 years after they graduated from my class in the wrong way. And now I would read about them in the headlines 2 or 3 years later in the right way. And both times they would come out with a diploma, but one path kept them in roughly the same narrative as they had been in before. And in the new pathway, they had an entirely different narrative that they were creating for themselves that aligned with their self-worth. And so the outcomes were dramatically different.
Man, I tell you, that is so impactful to hear about. We know these things. I think as adult educators, that's not anything new to any of us when we think about how we know that a high school equivalency opens doors. The way that somebody goes through those doors and what they do once they go through those doors can be impacted one way or another as well by what they learn in the classroom. That is so huge. And I love that. I'm getting chills just listening to that because as much as you think of, former students of yours, I think of former students of mine on both ends of that,
Yeah.
that you were talking about. Now, one thing that you had mentioned a little bit earlier was the term self-led learning.
Yeah.
And your website, which we will have, by the way, in the session description and on our website, is selfledclassroom.com.
Yeah.
So what is self-led learning?
So that's a nod to the work of Dick Schwartz that we do better with really just everything in life when our own internal system has confidence, not only in its survivability for the moment that it's in, but also that it has the skills to care for itself as it moves through life. That's what it means to be self-led, is that I have the capacity to care for myself, even the parts of myself that may have been pretty torn up by life and actually even believed that tearing was the right thing. So once I make that shift and I start saying, oh, I have value in my story and I'm going to protect this thing that has value. And part of that capacity for protecting this thing that has value is that we don't go it alone. So the art of being self-led is to actually recognize that the self that you carry into the center is not alone, that you're connected to everybody else around you, and that they have that as well. So the hidden secret in the self-led classroom is that the teacher is the first person who needs to be self-led, that I have to be able to model what it means to care about myself and what it means to show up for myself in a way that keeps me connected to the people around me and doesn't sustain isolation. Because so much of what goes on for our students is that sense of I'm suffering, nobody knows that I'm suffering, the teacher's not even looking at me, nobody cares, I'm all by myself. My story's unique and nobody else has the same story. And hidden beneath that, the subtext is, and this moment is not survivable because of it. This moment is not something that I'm going to be able to overcome. So I would often counsel my students regularly. I would tell them so many times through the course of the year, I will never teach you anything that is harder than you are smart. You will always have the biological capacity to handle the idea that I'm going to share with you. The challenge is going to be getting that part of yourself that has doubt, run, and fear, getting that part to step back so the rest of your system can show up and run the show. And that part inside of you is usually kind of young. It was formed when you were a kid that says, no, I can't do math. And I'm going to tell you that that's a child's narrative because math is doable. What happened was that somebody left you behind when you were a kid and you interpreted that as you can't do math. No, that's not it. The adults left you behind. So if somebody goes slow enough, shows you the steps clearly enough, if you're there as a group and you're resourced with people all around you who can help you through this and you can see all your tools, you're going to 100% get through this. And the second part of the story is there's no idea that I'm going to ever share with you that's going to be worse than anything you ever experienced already in your life and survived. You've already survived unbelievable things in your life. All my little ideas are tiny, tiny things. They're never going to be anywhere near as painful as this stuff that you've already survived and gotten through, and that you've shown yourself strong enough to be back in the mix again. I promise you, there's no idea that'll even compare to what you've already shown yourself capable of surviving. So no idea is too big, neither for your brain, nor for your psyche that's back there with the narrative that you can't handle it. I just got to change how you see the world. You now need to see people around you. You need to see that people love you and they care about you and they're not going to leave you behind. And so I would make the commitment to my students. I would say, I'm not going to leave you behind and neither are your peers. And my guys who'd done 20 years in Salinas State Penitentiary would weep in class. And they would say through, gasping breath, no one has ever said that to me in a classroom before. And I would say, well, we're saying it to you now, and look somebody in the eye and just know that the promise is there. It's legit. Look around you. How many other people who've walked this path and now they're leaders in the community, giving back, and they carried this idea out. So it's gotten out beyond the classroom. I'm really happy to say when my students who are struggling with sobriety were in clinics or support systems, quite often their counselor, their therapist, whoever it may be, sometimes the executive director of the agency, was somebody who had graduated from my class a few years before. And so now, because they've shifted the way they see, they can now see this person as an asset, and they can see this person as part of a larger web of connection. So that isolation narrative gets stripped away, and we have a sense of community that carries us forward.
So, really, what I'm hearing are two big things. One, and you already used this word connection,
Mhm.
this idea of connection versus isolation. Because,
Yeah.
like you said, isolation is very damning almost. It's demeaning. It leaves you feeling hopeless sometimes. And with this feeling like you're misunderstood or that nobody cares. So,
Mhm.
when you have that feeling of connection as a contrast, it's really life-changing, and it really is. I mean, studies have shown that one of the main roots of addiction is isolation, that lack of connection with other people. As a species, we are very social, and we cannot grow, we cannot change, we cannot thrive without other people. We need that community. So, there's that connection piece, and then there's also this idea of capacity. There is nothing that is beyond your capacity. You can learn this, you can tackle this. And what I love about that acknowledgement that when you said no idea is too big, that there is nothing that you didn't already overcome. That is so freeing, I think, to any individual, whether they're an adult student or not, for any person to be told, you are stronger than anything that I am going to put in front of you
Yeah.
is huge because I've heard so many students, just like you said, say, I can't do math. That just seems to almost be this pervasive idea.
Oh,
At
yeah.
one point, they were told this, or they got frustrated, and like you said, they were left behind. So once they have that in their brain, they think, no, I just can't do math. Well, yes, you can. You know,
Yeah.
you've survived all of these things already. Of course, you can do math, you know?
Yeah.
So I really love that. And you had mentioned that self-led was a nod to Dick Schwartz. I also noticed that self, the SEL in self is capitalized, which
Yes.
I'm sure is a nod to social emotional learning,
Yeah.
right?
That's it.
Yeah.
Thank you for catching that. I appreciate that.
So that stuck out right away, but I figured that's, what it was.
Yeah. Because I want to distinguish it from, and this is one of the things that I talk about in my larger workshops, is that again, coming back to my martial arts instructor, we want to be able to say a thing to show that we know a thing. So I really sort of break down the language of self, like the difference between self worth, self esteem, and self respect. And on the other side of that, what we say is that psychic injury, leads us to be selfish or selfless. And I don't mean that in the selfless as I'm giving in kind. I don't mean it in that way. I mean it in the way that means I don't have any identity because I was so destroyed by what has happened that I can't trust my own thoughts, feelings, and needs anymore. I can't trust any of that. I just am driven by desire as I move through life. So part of what we're trying to do in the classroom, because we normalized taking care of ourselves, we want to become self-full. So I want to be able to read what I feel. I want to be able to read what I think. I want to read what's going on in my body. I want to be able to read my emotions, catch all those things, and then not get swept away by old parts of my system that learned destructive stories. I want to be able to tap the brakes and not get into a spiral of self-hatred. So one of the things that would happen regularly, I would say weekly in class, is that we would have somebody who would bump into something and they would start to dysregulate. And there were a whole bunch of sort of protocols in place for when they would have one of these challenges. And one of the things that I would talk about is I would talk about how quite often these parts that are inside of ourselves that carry the narrative of powerlessness, right? Because that's just one of the characteristics of trauma, is, right? We're powerless to stop this thing from happening. So when we bump into powerlessness in a classroom, our body doesn't know that it's not the bad thing from the past. Our body just goes, oh my gosh, I'm powerless. And last time I couldn't get away and now I can. So one of the things that we talk about in class is that we don't want the 8-year-old to grab the car keys inside of ourselves. And we also don't want to hate the 8-year-old. We just want to lovingly embrace that part of ourselves, in a way, give a kind of self-led forgiveness to that part so that the 8-year-old lets go of the car keys and the adult part of our system can then drive the car. Then what happens is the rest of the class will validate the person as they're going through that, and they'll go, "Oh, yeah, my 8-year-old just showed up a few minutes ago, but I was able to keep her quiet, or I was able to keep him quiet." And they're great about it, and it's that sense of community where I can not be perfect and still be loved. That allows us to take the protective gear off and stay open for the classroom experience in a way that allows more pieces of the brain to come online. So it's not that things never ever happen in the classroom, but they happen and we know we're still loved in the middle of it. And we still belong, we still have value. And that's for folks who in many cases have never believed that, acted like it, or been treated like it. Right? So when it happens and it sort of starts to gel, you'll see somebody have a moment and the person next to them, because I don't have to be the person running around taking care of everybody. They'll just turn to each other and they'll say, "No, it's all right. I've gone through that too. It's all good. Just stay. Just stay. You'll be all right. Nobody's giving you grief because you're having a panic attack right now. It's fine." And so what ends up happening, what I say in my workshops, is that a 5-minute conversation turns into 5 weeks of attendance. And that's where the rubber hits the road in adult ed, as we all know, is that the attrition rate is off the charts and folks disappear. And we often don't know why beyond the real mechanical stuff that we get reported back to, like I needed a job, et cetera, et cetera. Well, in my experience, 90% of what our students tell us is a cover for having the 8-year-old grab the car keys and take him out of the room. And so if we can get that 8-year-old to know that it's love, and we're not doing therapy. I don't need to know what happened. I never need to know what happened. I don't need to know any of the details. I just need folks to know that they're okay. Welcome. There's a place at the table for you. And if you're not ready to eat right now, just know there's a place at the table for you. And when you come back, it'll still be there.
Community.
That's
Again,
it.
the
That's it.
community, the connection, all of
Yeah.
that. It's yes, absolutely. So huge. Thank you so much for all of that. And I have been doing a whole lot of talking.
Hmm.
And I think, Nadia, it's your time.
Tag.
Tag, you're it.
I guess. Or I could just sit here silently and you host today.
Nah.
No, Tim, you had a lot of really just wonderful things to say about the work you do, and you're clearly really passionate. You really, have so many years experience and just dedication to this. So I feel kind of like pulling it back. I feel kind of silly just to ask the question of just why social emotional learning. So let me maybe try to frame this a little differently. So like you said, you have so many years experience, and what we know from the adult education field is it's so hard.
Mhm.
We're very under-resourced, underfunded. Our instructors almost overwhelmingly are part-time. We all know this. I'm speaking to the choir here. But I guess what I'm trying to say is, like, we have to do so much with so little.
Yeah.
And especially professional development, which is not always compensated. It's really different. In New Mexico, we're lucky to have a system in place. And what I'm trying to say is we have so little time and so little resources,
Yeah.
and we do need to support our students with their academic goals. That's usually the primary for our field. So I guess my question is, why social emotional learning in that context of, like, why invest in this?
Great, thanks. That's a good hard question, and I appreciate it. So the first thing is, let me absolutely validate what you're saying about how hard it is to be in adult ed. In every facet, we are in a very hard arena. It's hard for the teachers, it's hard for the administration, it's hard for support staff, and it's really hard for students. So that needs to be honored and validated and actually kept up in the atmosphere so that we don't forget that we're actually overcoming things that are really tough, because the outcomes then become spectacular when you consider how hard this whole system is to operate in. So the reason why SEL is real critical in that space, and I want you to be aware that this is not like a huge amount of added on material that's happening. When I was teaching in class, I'm lecturing on math, I'm lecturing on science, I'm lecturing on social studies, I'm lecturing on the essay. I'm doing all of that normal presenting work, but I'm reading my class and watching my students either be able to take it in or not be able to take it in. That's really the dividing line. They can take it in or they can't take it in. And the can't take it in thing is almost always going to produce either hypoarousal or hyperarousal. So hyperarousal means they're real agitated and up, and hypoarousal means their body just shuts down, boom, and their capacity to take in information is gone. There's almost a numbness and like a tunnel vision that occurs. So I could say whatever it is that I want to say, and it's just going to be bouncing off the person's head and not going in anywhere. And that's not necessarily in any way correlated to the content, right? So I could say anything as benign as you could possibly imagine, and then I'll watch somebody's body either get hyper aroused or hypo aroused, and I'll say, "Oh, okay, something's up." And in that space, I'll pause for a moment. I'll say a general statement to everybody out there so nobody feels targeted. Nobody thinks that I'm singling them out because that's shaming, right? So I'll just say, now for some of you guys, this might be a little bit challenging that we're going through right now, but I want you to just remember the things that I always teach you. Number one, it's never going to be harder than you are smart. Number two, you've already survived really tough stuff. Number three, you got people all around you who can help you through the process. And I get a paycheck for you to bug me so much I complain about you when I go home. So, so please bug me a lot until you get this thing. So then what happens, and that's SEL, by the way. That thing that I just did is SEL. The system settles down and the person starts to not feel the opposite of self-worth and the opposite of self-esteem and the opposite of self-respect. They stay away from that psychological narrative. And they start to say, well, maybe I should ask. Maybe I should slow down and just take a breath. And then what that ends up producing is it ends up producing persistence, which is one of the big things in adult ed, right? We want people to stick around and stay when it gets tough. We want to see them transition, which for a lot of our folks, the reason why they don't transition into another program is because of that narrative that they have inside, that moment of change is a moment of risk. And they're thinking, this is not a survivable moment. I want out. And then last but not least is where excuse me, I flipped my order, should go persistence, graduation, and then transition. So that graduation moment also is very fragile for my population. It's the moment where the story of their life is going to change, and what they've been called forever is going to change, and what they expect of themselves is going to change. So if I don't wrap that with some really good SEL skills, then I lose my students on their fifth test, or if it's the GED, on their fourth test. And I can't tell you how many times our school had to call 911 for people having off the chart panic attacks on the entry into the testing center for their very last test. It was really overwhelming. So when I'm saying why SEL, that's why SEL, because my folks get the fifth test. And then they transition into whatever college, almost always college program that's in the community that has a pipeline set up for them. And they know that they're supported all the way through. And that's that antithesis of isolation thing. And Jamie, if I may refer back to something that you said that I think is really critical, that the opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Mhm.
The opposite of truancy and recidivism and dropping out is also connection. My folks feel connected to people. They show up because of the relationships. And and because they have those relationships, they stay inside the system long enough to grow themselves. So yeah, that whole idea of how do we put it in and why do we put it in? Right. So the how is actually fairly straightforward. It takes 60 seconds to put something that's SEL into the middle of the lesson. That then frees up my energy and my students' energy to produce so much more good work farther down because we don't have the pushback of the psyche defending itself. It suddenly, the psyche goes, oh, no, my needs are actually going to be met. There's no threat in here, is there? Okay. Oh, I don't have to protect myself. This is good. Yeah. And I can stay in the mix. And so my thought is if the K-12 folks got their hands on this and started integrating it at an early age, it would actually, I used to start my workshops by saying, my objective is to put myself out of work in the classroom. That's what my objective is. So I want to train enough teachers in how to build relationship with other students that they never drop from school in the first place and they don't ever end up in the GED high set or high school diploma programs. That if they're in there for anything, they're in there by choice and saying there's something enriching at the adult school that I want to take. I don't want to have to be here because I have to. So yeah, that's the YSEL part. And if I may, the last piece of this is SEL in its original sense. It's SEL as in I'm getting social skills and I'm getting emotional skills. It's not about the stuff that's so prevalent that's out there in the world today, which is all about cultivating presence and having a sort of meditative mind in order to handle an academic setting. That's useful skills. Trust me. Those are really good, solid skills for a person to have. But for me, SEL is about being social and about being connected to others. And then how to self-regulate my emotions so I can stay present for what's going on in this game that's in front of me right now. That's not going to change just because I run.
Thank you, Tim. Really excellent.
Thank you.
You give us a lot of food for thought. But just pulling back, so the kind of work that you do with your business, your professional development, do you work on an individual practitioner basis, like one-on-one, or do you provide sort of like overall team training?
So I'm really glad you asked that. I'm really glad. Coincidentally, I'm just getting ready to launch that as part of the menu of offerings that I have in the business. So up until now, it's been primarily professional development experiences, but I've been getting a lot of requests at an individual level where people are facing a particularly challenging part of the work and they would like some mentoring on a one-to-one level. And so that should be up and running within the next 2 weeks on the website. So just about the time this is all ready to go to production, I should have that up and going. Because I do think, as I often say in my workshops, these are really deep waters. And in many of the workshops, we only get to dip our toes in it, and people want so much more. So I want to be able to provide that for them.
Excellent. That's really exciting. I am happy to hear that. So you recently, like Jamie mentioned, you provided a couple of sessions at our education and literacy conference, or our state conference. Can you
Yeah,
tell us about what you presented on for those who may have missed it?
yeah, certainly. So let's start with the small one first. And the small one I did on trauma informed lesson design. That one was really about getting some very nitty gritty details about how certain facets of the trauma response can be triggered in a classroom really easily, actually, and what we can do when we design a lesson to sort of head that off at the pass if we are proactive. Well, now we can't stop every possibility. We can't think up because the brain is infinitely creative in ways that it accesses its own trauma response. But as teachers, we can do a whole lot of stuff to eliminate things like shame and powerlessness and a lack of resource, et cetera. There's quite a few things we could do. And so when we do lesson design, and that's what that workshop was about, how do we design a lesson so that we reduce the experience of powerlessness in the classroom? And then the other one, the larger one, was serving students in challenging times. And I don't think there's anybody who can look at the state of our nation right now and not consider these challenging times. And, and I would say that for our students, much of their lives have been spent in challenging times in their own personal experience, as well in a social context. So how do we support students when that's the reality that they're swimming in, and in this case, we're all swimming in it as well, collectively moving through? How do we do this when we know that funding is fragile, right? How do we know this when the 10 pathways that used to be available for our students have been now narrowed down to 3 pathways? How do we still show up for the job? How do we still make sure that this moment matters, the moment that I have their eyes on mine and my eyes on theirs? How do we make sure that that moment matters so that they know they matter in the moment? Because if I can make the moment matter, then they'll know that they matter in the moment. And that's really one of the critical things that we're chasing. And that does 2 things. Number 1, it gives us a sense of connection. I'm not alone. And number 2, it gives me a sense of worth and value. And that's how I can ground my behaviors. As long as I'm grounding my behaviors in my self-worth, the outcomes are usually way more healthy than if they're not grounded in my self-worth. Now, I'm not ever teaching that workshop from the viewpoint that we're going to change that larger social system that's out there in the world. If it happens, great. What I want to be able to do is make sure that my student knows that they matter in the moment that they're with me. And that gives them a little bit of extra oomph to get through whatever might be going on elsewhere. If I may, for a moment, I'll just tell a quick story about my student, Francisco Solano. And I know it's okay for me to use his name because he said it's all right to talk about me whenever you present. So Francisco's a sweetheart. And when I first met him, he was working in the packing sheds in the Salinas Valley. And now he's pursuing his doctorate down in UCLA doing pancreatic cancer research. And I was going to present the statewide accomplishment in adult education for the state of California to Francisco down at the conference down in LA. And he's at UCLA. So I said, hey, why don't we go together and that way we can have lunch and spend some time together and chat. And so in that journey, we went out to eat. And I said, Francisco, I will tell you that one of the biggest, I don't know, like the guardrails that I have as an educator is the first do no harm thing, right? It's just first do no harm. Do not mess this up. You have this moment. And if you don't mess this moment up, Tim, then Francisco can really lead Francisco's life. And so I don't ever get to claim credit for all your accomplishments. But what I do get a claim for credit for, and happily, is that I didn't screw it up in the moment that I had you with me. And so that's the only part of the story that I get to lay my hands on. All the rest is on you. And I hope you feel proud of yourself for how much worth you see in yourself now, because that's a thing to be proud of. And he said, I got to be honest with you. I'm a little ambivalent to be getting the award because it's about behaviors. It's about doing a thing. And what I know is I have value whether I do a thing or I don't do a thing. And I said, hallelujah, man, that's exactly why you're the best candidate for the award, is because you know your worth no matter what. And that's what this is all about. So that's my story about Francisco as a way to highlight what it means for us to be there for our students during challenging times. It's that first do no harm thing and be responsive to their needs and responsive to needs in a way that they know that they're valued so they can then launch. And when they launch, I think everybody out there is going to be more grateful. Well, not everybody. The guys in the packing shed are probably less grateful. But everybody else out there is more grateful that Francisco's working on pancreatic cancer than working on packing strawberries. And I know the doors that it's opened up for him so that more of him can develop in this world. I think he's grateful for that as well. So That's what the work was about on serving students in challenging times. And that's one where we get into some pretty deep water because as teachers we carry grief and we often don't realize how much grief we carry. So part of what do no harm is not let my grief flood my own behaviors in the classroom. Yeah, that I still have to say, instead of saying eat, 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 I have to say, are you hungry? And yeah, that's really what that work is about.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing that story, Tim.
Yeah.
If you don't mind, I do have a question, but it is off script.
It's okay.
Yeah. So one of the things I'm also was drawn to, not just your experience, but also that you launched this business. And I was just curious. I know it's kind of still in newish stages, but I was wondering do you have any advice for practitioners who also have like, years and years of experience, education, all this knowledge that could potentially be lost if they do fully,
Yeah.
if they do fully retire. But do you have any like advice about starting your own business in this way?
The tricky thing about adult ed is that we are islands unto ourselves, both as teachers and as agencies, right? So we are often battling the very same isolation that harms our students, we are battling as well. And we can kind of get comfortable in that space. We can sort of normalize our isolation instead of saying, hey, I or the agency have needs, and those needs are valid and legitimate, and I'm going to act on them. And so, sort of making ourselves advocate for ourselves. I was in the box and isolated for how long was that? That was 20 some odd years before I decided to take this out into the public eye. And because adult ed was under resourced, there were not a whole lot of pathways for me to be able to go and present. So, on the positive side of things, beyond the whole challenge of advocating for oneself and becoming sort of loud and proud and out about what you do and who you are, right? Beyond that, frankly, the conference pathway is the pathway for adult educators to get their material known by others. And it's a good testing ground because your audience, they're folks who know what this thing is all about. And if they're not in with you, you may want to rethink about how you're presenting material. They're really good judges of how your material is being seen. So beyond just advocating for yourself, I would say get out and get into the conference circuit and present at various agencies. And then when people like your work, they'll call you on the phone and they'll say, hey, can you come train? And little by little, you get known because there is not, I will say this really directly about the work that I do. There aren't a whole lot of folks out there who have ever experienced this stuff in an academic setting, so they don't even know to think the thoughts. I did a presentation a few years ago for my really, really good boss that I had at the Salinas Adult School. And my boss was in my workshop for the very first time. And he raised his hand to make a comment. And he said, I've been in education for decades, and I've never heard anybody say what you're saying right now. It was not in my teacher training program. It was not in any staff development that I was in. It was never in a meeting. And I'm getting this for the first time at this stage in my career. So the need is there, the desire is there, but it is a blank slate in many cases. So that you have to give yourself permission to push through that and say, I'm just going to disturb people because my students are worth it at the end of the day. At the end of the day, my students and their babies who are waiting for them to come home from work are worth it. And so that should give us plenty of energy to catalyze us into the next stage with this stuff. So yeah, advocate and use the conference pathway because there aren't a whole lot of folks who will know what it is that we do in adult ed, even other adult educators. Yeah. We're so isolated in our fields.
And, I'd like to interject just a second on that because that is exactly how we were so lucky to have you at our conference. For everybody that's listening, when we put out our call for presenters, Tim, you submitted the proposals, and I had never heard your name before and decided to reach out to learn a little bit more. And I'm so glad that we were able to bring you to New Mexico to present. And it was because you took that leap and submitted proposals. Otherwise, we would have never known.
Yeah,
Thank
you
you.
heard it straight from Tim, everybody. We better see double the amount of proposal submissions for next year's conference.
Yes.
It's how you make money. That's it.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's how you make money, and it's how you really move the dial, because so much of what we do is really good. But because we're isolated, nobody knows we're good. My bosses for decades, they would walk by my room and they would just go, "Well, we have no idea what you're doing in there, and it's really scary to us, and we don't want to know. Just keep doing it because it works." So like even my bosses couldn't advocate for me, right? So we have to get up and move it on our own. And we're advocating for our students to be integrated members of society, to get out and do good things in the world that reflect their goodness, right? To get out there and you got to be kind of bold and brave to do that. So for us as educators, we want to role model that and say, yeah, I'm going to give it a shot. I'm going to have faith. And last but not least, doesn't have to be perfect. You'll get better as you go along. Apologies to everybody who was in my first 2 or 3 trainings.
From what I learned at conferences and presentations, is there are a lot of presentations that teach you what not to do. So I think you really help people out in those sessions too.
Mm.
Or, yeah, all joking aside, I'm sure they're not as bad as you feel like they are. But thank you so much for your time today and your just sharing what you do and your dedication and passion and your advice too, because like I said, I went off script. We did not send that to you ahead of time. So you just had that, shared that free advice. Thank you. How,
Thank you, Nadia.
how can our listeners contact you, Tim?
So the easiest thing of all is just to reach out to me through the website. I have the contact information on the back end of selfledclassroom.com, and they will be able to email me directly, tamaral@selfledclassroom.com. And if you want to do the old snail mail thing, that's also good. My mailing address is in there as well. But yeah, reach out to me via the website, and that's the best way to contact me.
Great. Yes. Well, and like Jamie said, we'll definitely have that information on there. And again, thanks so much for your time today. We really are just so grateful to have you.
Oh, thank you both.
Yes.
I'm really grateful. I'm really excited about the work that you're doing. Your conference was great. If that's emblematic of what's happening in the state of New Mexico, you guys are rocking over there. So thank you for letting me be a part of that.
Yes. Thank you so much for sharing all of this, not just with New Mexico, but nationally. We really appreciate it. And again, appreciate your time today.
I probably should have said that I'm going to be presenting at COABE. So if anybody wants to go to the national conference, I'll be there in Indianapolis presenting both for the pre-conference and for the main conference.
That is great to know. Yes. So you guys heard that. Tim will be at COABE. Hopefully we'll see you all there too.
Thank you both.
Thank you. Don't forget about My Adult Ed Story, a continuous project that highlights the lived experiences and origin stories of adult education and literacy practitioners. Each story is unique, and the more we learn about each other, the stronger our network becomes. Please consider sharing your written or audio recorded story with us. A link to the My Adult Ed Story page, as well as submission instructions, are included in this episode's description. We look forward to growing this collection.
Connect with Adult Ed, the NMEA podcast, is a project of the Propel Professional Learning System and is funded by the New Mexico Higher Education Department's Adult Education Division. Thank you for listening.